let's start with this question of realism itself. What do I mean by realism? There are lots of things that term might mean. In philosophy, it tends to mean the thesis that some things are independent of the mind. Some things are independent of how we think about them. There really is a way the world is out there, you might say. And it's that way whether we think it's that way or not. Whatever our attitudes or thoughts about it might be, it is the way it is. Some aspects of the world are really independent of the mind. They're really out there in a profound sense. An idealist thinks that everything is actually mind-dependent, that what we call the world is really a projection or a construction of the mind. We've already talked about somebody who has that kind of attitude, Nietzsche, who said really the world rests on a number of errors and fantasies, and so thinks of the world as a kind of projection of the mind. That sort of attitude is one that implies that there are no mind-independent facts. There's no such thing as the world as it is out there completely independently of us. Now, in Western philosophy, idealism is a relative latecomer. It starts gaining ground in, I suppose, the 18th century. But in Indian philosophy, for example, it was there in ancient thought, in fact, as maybe the most dominant point of view in ancient India. And so how strong the idealistic strain is in a culture really varies from culture to culture. In any case, in ethics, this has a special sort of power. You might think there really is a way the world is out there, and a world described by science, but nevertheless be an idealist about ethics. So when we turn to ethics, there's a specific version of this debate that arises. The realist about ethics thinks that some things are right and some things are wrong, independently of us, independently of the way we think about them. The idealist thinks, no, that we are in effect constructing systems of morality, calling certain things right, calling certain things wrong, thinking of certain things as virtuous and other things as not virtuous. Now, it makes a difference, and not just an abstract philosophical difference. It makes a real difference to me, for example, whether I think that I'm the source of value, whether I'm the one who is calling certain things virtuous or vicious, right or wrong, just or unjust, or whether they really have that status independently of me, whatever I happen to think about it. So it matters whether there's a source outside of me that I had better live up to and match, or whether there's a source that's inside me, over which maybe I have some degree of control. Now, of course, it might be me specifically that is the source. It might be humanity in general that is the source. The idealist could say that morality is really a mental construction, maybe of my individual mind. Maybe it's a social construction of our minds together. The realist, in contrast, says, well, no, there really is a fact of the matter out there, independently of how we all think about whether something is just or unjust, right or wrong. So, when we turn from ethics to questions of meaning, of purpose, then this has a special force too. Is the meaning that my life has something that has me as its source? Can I decide what the meaning of my life is? Or is that something that we decide together? Or is it something that really it has, whether any of us thinks about it that way or not? Okay? Is the source of meaning for my life something that comes from me, or from us, or from something outside of us all? That turns out to be a critical question. And throughout the 20th century, we're going to look at people who have a variety of attitudes to that question. Am I free, in particular, to assign my actions any meaning I like? Or am I answerable to something else? And if it is something else, is it something else like my society or humanity at large? Or is it something higher? Is it something that is really an external source out there in the world? Maybe God, maybe just the structure of the world itself, to which I am answerable, and which I individually or us together really are powerless to affect. Well, this is true, not only at the individual level, but at the level of an entire society. Do we together have control of the meaning and values of our lives? Are we the sources of value, or is it something else? Are we answerable to something outside of us? That's a question that we're going to see arising again and again. And here I'll just hark back to the motto for the course from Richard Fernandez. It matters a lot whether there really exists something independently of us to which we have to answer. The key idea behind civilization, he argues, and indeed all progress, is that there is something out there that represents the truth. It exists independently of us. We can't simply make it up. Once that's granted, all else is detail. Now, is Fernandez a realist or an idealist? A realist, very clearly. He's saying the key question, he thinks, is whether there is something outside us, and he thinks civilization depends on being a realist, recognizing that there is something out there to which we're answerable. So, that becomes the key question we're going to consider with variety places. Are human institutions the sources of value, the sources of meaning, the sources of authority, or is it something else? Do we live inside the world of the unread book, as he puts it? That structure outside of us that actually determines something to which we have to answer. Now, we've talked a little bit about the changes in the 19th century. I don't want to go back and rehash all of that, but I do want to say that by the end of the 19th century, the situation was dramatically different from the situation at the beginning of the 19th century. We've talked about the first industrial revolution that introduced a tremendous amount of hardship into the cities of Europe, and yet nevertheless also allowed for much greater prosperity. And then we looked at the second industrial revolution in the second half of the 19th century that spread affluence through a much larger group of society, and that also improved living standards considerably, enabled modern medicine, for example, to actually take a foothold. It began to reduce death rates, get disease under control. Population grew dramatically. This population moved from the countryside into the cities. And so there were tremendous advances. Now, those steady, large rises in income, combined with a sort of greater predictability of life, enabled people to start doing things that they couldn't have done before. Real wages were up by 2/3 in Britain, and had doubled by 1914 from what they had been 100 years earlier. And so people were, in general, much more prosperous. The average person, not just the wealthy, was much better off. They lived more safely, they lived more prosperously, they had money left over after buying the things that they actually needed to live. They could think about what they wanted. Now, life was still hard by our standards. People typically worked 5.5 10-hour days. But they did have enough time and enough money to actually buy things they wanted. And so this was the era of the rise of department stores, of shopping districts, of large manufacturing plants. And you see a variety of things that were all built at the end of the 19th century. For example, here, that is inside a department store in Berlin, constructed at the very end of the 19th century. Here you see the shopping district in Toronto, right around 1900. Here you see a depiction of the shopping districts in Paris, and of other cities in art. You see portrayals of bourgeois life that would have been extremely rare, if not impossible, later. People who were not wealthy, but nevertheless affluent enough to actually go to cafes, to frequent restaurants, to make possible a kind of life that many of us now take for granted, but was a relatively new thing a little more than 100 years ago. So that change in living standards. Here you see a woman, for example, on her sofa in a very beautiful dress. She's not a wealthy baroness, she's not a member of the nobility, but nevertheless, she exhibits a kind of lifestyle that was a new thing toward the end of the 19th century. There were other changes. The rise of mass education. By the end of the 19th century, in most industrialized countries, literacy was almost universal. There was free mass primary education. And it was often required. Why? Part of it was to establish a secular basis for society outside of church education. Part of it was the need for skilled labor. Partly it was a question of political participation. To the extent that countries were becoming more democratic, it was thought to be more important to have an informed populace. Partly it was to instill some degree of patriotism and to give rise to a common culture, especially because of rates of immigration and the mass influx of people into the cities, both from the surrounding countryside and from other nations. People felt that schooling was needed to instill a kind of common culture, to give people a common background. Well, all of that led to the rise of schools as we know them today. Here are pictures of schools from, well, a little over 100 years ago. It's not exactly just like today, but it's not too different. There's a German student. Yeah, I'm looking at the guy behind him, copying from his paper. Well, anyway, as literacy became almost universal, that made a lot of other things possible. For example, you needed teachers to actually teach in these schools, and so there was a rise of teachers' colleges, often intended for women. And so for the first time, women began to gain access to higher education on a large scale. Since people could read, this was the era of the creation of mass circulation magazines, of newspapers, and in general, the rise of popular culture, the rise of music halls, theaters, and that sort of culture that led to a common culture that was popular, the rise of popular music as opposed to just the music of symphonic orchestras and the music of chambers for the wealthy and so forth, to team sports. And so this was the era of the construction of great public libraries. Here, the reading room of the New York Public Library. Here, women in class at a teacher's college. Here, a women's college started around this time. That's the May Day celebration at Bryn Mawr, where it's wonderful. When you're a senior at Bryn Mawr, they wake you up at, well, 6 a.m. on May 1st and feed you this fabulous breakfast that includes strawberries and cream. And then people go outside and wear these white dresses and dance around maypoles. Yeah, I was actually at Bryn Mawr College on May Day my senior year, so I actually got the strawberries and cream. I did not put on a white dress and dance around maypoles, but lots of other people did. Anyway, this was the rise of the theater and of people who became stars in the theater. So here you see some of the stars at the time, or this is a sort of Rockettes Dancing Girl review of the rise of team sports. The first World Series was played in 1903. Between what teams? The Boston Red Sox and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Okay, the Boston Red Sox, the Pittsburgh Pirates. The Red Sox great star was Cy Young, after whom the Cy Young Pitching Award is named. And here you see the field after a game. Well, anyway, let's turn then to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The reason I've mentioned this background is that Doyle's stories appeared in popular magazines. They were often published as serials. One novel actually combined these, but mostly he published things in these magazines. The entire venue that made his writing possible was something that was a relatively recent invention. And a lot of things began to be serialized in this sort of way. In fact, people at this time began to specialize in the cliffhanger ending. So you're reading this part of the story, and you get to this, and suddenly it ends, right? And you've got to buy the next issue of the magazine to find out how the story continues. And so there's a style of writing now that has become almost a cliche that was a dramatically new thing right around the turn of the century as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was writing these stories. The idea of the mystery story, the idea of the serial, the thing that kept things going and made you want to tune in next month. Well, not tune in the way in which we do now for the next episode on a television series, let's say, but in this case, you had to go out there and buy that publication again to read the next installment of the story. Here's a picture of Doyle when he was on a trip to the United States. And his most famous character by far was Sherlock Holmes. He ended up feeling, to some extent, enslaved by Holmes. The public was demanding these stories all the time. He got tired of writing them. Finally decided to kill Holmes off. The public was so outraged at Holmes' death that they made him bring Holmes back. Now, tell me a little bit about Sherlock Holmes. You've read this story, and undoubtedly you know about Holmes from other sorts of representations. Holmes is somebody who is really an iconic sort of literary figure. Here we see Doyle having the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, some of these collected stories. A Study in Scarlet, one of his most famous stories. You see statues of Sherlock Holmes still in the British Isles. And you see other representations of this on television. Here, Sherlock, right? There on the series Elementary, where Watson is played by Lucy Liu. Actually, the series House was a medical series based on this. What if the doctor were Holmes and not Watson? That was really the leading idea behind the creation of that series. So, yes, well, before we get to that, actually, let me go back to this image of Holmes. Tell me about Sherlock Holmes on the basis of the stories. Yes?
Great observation.
Great an observation. Absolutely right. He sees things around himself that nobody else sees. And it's not that he just has remarkable vision or something. He notices things nobody else notices. What else about him? Yes? A master of deduction. Good. He sees how things connect. He's not only brilliant logically, but he understands how various facts link up to other facts. And so he's able to say, aha, I observe this, and I deduce that that means this and that means that. Now, in logic, people distinguish between deduction, where you have, as it were, all the information, the premises, and you're purely proving things on that basis, coming to conclusions that must be true given that. That's the kind of thing you do in mathematics or in logic itself, or in a lot of cases in computer science. But then there's induction, where you see causal relationships and you infer things on the basis of these causal relationships that there's strong evidence for. Often these arguments are very compelling, but they're not, strictly speaking, guaranteed. So what is often referred to as deduction in these stories is really what a logician would consider induction. Somebody who uses scientific reasoning, uses observation, uses statistics, uses a deep understanding of the way things work in the world to come to conclusions that are powerful conclusions, but not exactly guaranteed in the way that conclusions in mathematics and logic are. But nevertheless, whatever that is, Holmes is very good at it, right? Drawing inferences and reaching conclusions on the basis of evidence. What else is true of Holmes? Yes?
He's a master of disguise.
Good, a master of disguise. He's often dressing up as this, dressing up as that. He goes out and investigates, and sometimes in the stories we have no idea how he's doing it, but sometimes we do. He dresses up as something else and disguises himself. And in fact, one of the things that's remarkable about this story is that he runs up against an adversary that actually impresses him. To Sherlock Holmes, she was always the woman. Why was she the woman? She outsmarts him, right? And that's really rare. There are not many occasions in this book where somebody outsmarts Sherlock Holmes. What else is true of Holmes? What makes him remarkable? Okay, fantastic memory. He remembers all sorts of things that other people would maybe have observed and forgotten. Other things, yeah?
He's amazing at extrapolating conclusions.
Okay, he does extrapolate often. Yes, I mean, I mentioned these inductive chains of reasoning, but it's really quite remarkable because he carries them much further than other people. So it's not just that he's very good at inferring things. He actually goes way beyond these inferences, what other people would do. We might say, oh, yes, so you saw an ash, and you actually have the knowledge to have studied various kinds of ashes, and you know that was from a Turkish-made cigarette, and so on and so forth. Okay, impressive. But now what does that mean? Holmes is somebody who will say, and that means this person has recently traveled to the Middle East, and that means blah, 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 and that means it must be, you know, and most of us, even if we could keep up part of the way, we would stop extrapolating. We would at some point give up the chase in this chain of inference. But he keeps going much further than the average person, even if they had his talent at observation, would be able to go. What else?
He solves crimes but outside the law.
Well, he does solve crimes outside the law. The police typically play a very limited role. Now, in some of the TV representations, you will find Holmes actually, cooperating with the police a bit more. But in the actual stories, the police are idiots. We're going to come to this near the end. Yes, Lestrade and other representatives of Scotland Yard turn out to be just terrible, okay? And Holmes has no respect for them at all. So all of this is done sort of on the sly, apart from official channels. Yeah? What do you have in mind?
Like, there's a couple instances where he's like described as a heavy drinker or just like drugs.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, he takes part in, what he said is, Holmes at certain points says, but also we get some inklings from Watson. These are things that only pop up occasionally in the stories. And so it's partly going on things that Dr. Watson says or Holmes says himself, or just background. But yes, you can tell at certain points that Holmes is actually a rather heavy drug user. He takes part in human festivities, but, well, only of certain kinds, right? And actually of some of the more embarrassing kinds. So yeah, Holmes is somebody who actually, to some extent obscures, but to some extent amplifies his powers of deduction through the use of drugs. And that drug addiction of Holmes is something that plays a significant role in some of the stories and in some of the representations, like in Elementary, that's how Lucy Liu, the Dr. Watson of that particular version, gets to know Holmes in the first place. She's really his drug rehab connection. So, other things about Holmes. Yeah?
Does it really let his emotions get in the way?
Okay, good. He does not let emotion get in the way. He's remarkably unemotional. And in fact, when Watson is describing him, he describes that first of all. He says all emotions, and that one, that is to say love, particularly, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen. So he observes, he reasons, he does not feel, or at least to the extent he feels, he does not let it interfere with his reason. Emotions were abhorrent to him. And so I think as remarkable as Holmes is in his great powers in some dimension, he is also remarkable for utterly suppressing what little emotion he seems to have. Part of, again, what makes this story remarkable is that we do see Holmes seeming to have emotions. Most of them, that's not evident at all, but here he clearly does. For the trained reasoner to admit such intrusions into his own delicate and finely adjusted temper was to introduce a distracting factor which might throw a doubt on all his mental results. So Holmes here is partly an unemotional person, but partly suppressing emotion intentionally. He thinks it can only lead him astray. Okay? How do you solve a problem? You use reason. You use evidence. You use observation. You do not use emotion. You do not use intuition. Some of you I know have already begun reading, and a few of you have finished reading the Agatha Christie novel, and you see there another detective, Hercule Poirot, who is going to be in some respects similar to Holmes here. And you get a nice contrast in that book between someone who reaches conclusions on the basis of emotion and intuition, and then someone who insists on facts, reason, observation. So, David Hume said, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, but Holmes here is following Plato, part of a much older tradition saying, actually, reason isn't always, but nevertheless ought to be, the master of the passions. It's the passions that ought to be the slaves of reason, and not vice versa. And so Plato gives this image of the self as a chariot. Reason is there driving the chariot, and there are two horses. One is desire and one is emotion. And it's very important, Plato says, for reason to keep desire and emotion under control. They are constantly struggling to gain control of this chariot, especially desire. And so it's very important for reason to keep command, both for the happiness of the person and also in order to attain virtue. It's exactly the opposite of Hume, who wants basically reason to take a back seat. Well, here, clearly Doyle and Holmes are on the side of Plato and not on the side of Hume. Reason, he says, should be the master of the passions, not their slave. Now, the very first thing that one of you said is that Holmes excels at observation. And that is really important. You see, he tells Dr. Watson, but you do not observe. The distinction is clear. Now, what is the distinction between seeing and observing? Well, here is the example from the story. You've frequently seen the steps which lead up from the hall to this room. Watson says, frequently. How often? Well, some hundreds of times. Then how many are there? And Watson is absolutely floored by the question. How many? I don't know. Quite so. You have not observed, and yet you have seen. That is just my point. Now, there are stairs in this classroom, actually, going from the front to the back. You've undoubtedly seen them every time you've walked in, and you've walked up and down them probably a number of times. How many are there? Who knows without actually cheating and looking and counting them down? Somebody guesses 5. That's truly a guess. I mean, I don't know either. I'm no better than, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 steps to get all the way to the top. Anyway, that's something that, I now know because I just counted. I had not observed, and yet I had seen them. After teaching this for the very first time, I thought, wow, I have walked up to my office on the 4th floor of Wagoner Hall. How many times? And yet, how many steps are there? I don't know. So I went back and counted them. There are, if I remember correctly, 91. Yeah, which is why I don't often take the stairs. But anyway, yes, it's common that we see things all the time, right? But we do not observe them. And so suddenly, if somebody says, well, how many chairs are in this room? How many steps are there up to the back? I don't know. And I mean, how many windows are in the house that you grew up in? Undoubtedly, unless you've actually had the task of buying screens for them or something, you don't know. Now, that tells us something important. When he talks about observing, it is not just observing, and not even just observing in the sense of counting and paying attention to things you don't otherwise pay attention to. There's a medieval Chinese philosopher, Wang Yangming, who is said to have sat in front of grass, a field of grass, watching it blow for 7 days straight. He was so impressed with Confucian arguments that the core to all understanding and virtue is the observation of things, the investigation of things, that he watched the grass grow for 7 days. And you know what he concluded at the end of 7 days of watching the grass grow? It was boring and he had learned nothing. And so he became a prominent neo-Confucian. However, the significance is this. It's not enough simply to watch. You've got to actually observe. Moreover, it's not even enough to observe. You've got to then investigate. So, investigation involves the application of scientific method. And this is part of the reason the Holmes stories go beyond mere observation. It's not just that he notices all sorts of things that other people don't notice. He then uses those things in reasoning. He actually investigates things. He studies the ashes left by various kinds of tobacco, and so on and so forth. He does science. And that isn't just a matter of watching the grass grow or watching ashes fall from people's cigarettes or that type of thing. It's a matter of actually forming hypotheses, testing them through experimentation. So it's really all of scientific method and not just observation that's going on in these stories. This, by the way, is from the Sherlock Holmes Museum. This is a representation of his study where he has all this scientific equipment. So in science, people don't just watch, they ask questions. They attend to the relevant factors. They formulate hypotheses. They test them against the evidence. And they remain open to new information. And Holmes exhibits all of those in the stories. So yes, he is highly observant, but it isn't just observation in the sense that he watches closely and pays attention and remembers. He also theorizes, he hypothesizes, he tests things, he remains open to new information. He uses scientific method. Now, there is something else special that happens in this story. The king comes to Holmes, and he's very upset, right? Why is he upset? Well, because there's this compromising photograph. He's about to be married, but he had an affair with someone, Irene Adler, earlier, and she is in possession of a photograph of the two of them together. And he's very upset about it. Holmes at first doesn't understand what's going on. He says, look, I fail to follow your majesty. If this young person should produce her letters for blackmailing or other purposes, how is she to prove their authenticity? Well, there is the writing. He's German at all. Who put forgery? My private notepaper, stolen. My own seal, imitated. My photograph, bought. We were both in the photograph. Oh dear. That is very bad, Holmes says. Your Majesty has indeed committed an indiscretion. Now, what is special about photography here? The existence of the letters, we get that left, forged. But they have your seal, stolen, etc., right? Why is that so bad that if there's a photograph with the two of them? What's special about photography? Notice, if we simply had a story, right? People have written a story about a scandalous affair between the two of us. That doesn't prove anything, right? You can write anything you want. What if, oh, sorry, that's meant to be a movie poster. Yes, there's a movie about this scandal. Whatever. Could be fiction. There's a story about it. Fiction. There's a painting of it. Oh, there's a painting of the two of you together. That doesn't prove anything, right? Well, there's another kind of painting. It's entitled The Scandalous Affair of the King. So, well, that doesn't show anything. However, there's something about camera that changes this, right? Here's an iconic photograph from the 20th century. This kiss on the day of the large celebration, celebrating the end of World War II. This sailor kisses this nurse. Now, the existence of the evidence is pretty, or the photograph is pretty good evidence that that kiss took place, right? In a way that a mere story about this would not be. Why? Or think about a finish line at a race. We have a camera there to determine, in close cases, who won the race. Why a camera and not an artist, let's say? Or a philosopher saying, what is it to win a race? What is a race? What's so important about a camera? Yeah?
It's not up to human interpretation.
Okay, good. It isn't up to human interpretation. It looks like it's recording something without human intervention, right? Yeah?
Weren't those cameras back then have negatives? Those two, the original?
Well, yes, the camera technology then was rather different from our current technology, but still, what it has in common with our contemporary technology is that there's a physical process, right? A purely physical, purely causal process, leading from the event to the photographic representation of the event. Now, of course, some photographs may not show what's going on because they're bad photographs. It might be that, yeah, this doesn't show you much of what the side of that building looks like because it was poorly taken, so they don't always represent everything. And then there are photographs that might go wrong in another way. I mean, Doyle actually did have a determinate shape of his head. This is actually a double exposure, if you look at it carefully. It's not like he had this halo going around his head in real life, right? And of course now we can Photoshop things that even in the early days people could manipulate negatives and do things to alter photographs. But nevertheless, there is a causal process here. The normal outcome of that causal process is something that actually represents things accurately. It leaves human intervention typically out of that process, and so you've got a sort of mechanical, photovoltaic representation of what actually occurred. Now, a realist thinks that's true of human perception too. We don't always see things. We don't always get things right when we do see them. We don't always remember them correctly, but normally we do actually perceive things correctly. Okay, our perceptual faculties too, like a camera, operate by a causal process. And so the normal outcome of that is also an accurate representation of the world. Well, now, Irene Adler. She does play a very special role here. And there's a lot that goes on in the story that I won't actually recount. But finally, Holmes does confront Adler once she's outsmarted him, and she writes him a note and says, "As in the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than he. The king may do what he will without hindrance from one whom he's cruelly wronged. I keep it only to safeguard myself and to preserve a weapon that will always secure me from any steps he might take in the future." And the king, hearing this, says, "Oh, what a woman! Oh, what a woman!" Okay? Did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she have not made an admirable queen? Is it not a pity she was not on my level? And Holmes responds by saying, "From what I've seen, she is indeed on a very different level from your Majesty." Now, I think Holmes's reaction here tells us a lot about Doyle's own ideals. So Holmes is, in some ways, a real Enlightenment ideal. What is that? Well, there are certain theses that are important, I think, to Enlightenment thinking, and that Holmes exemplifies in these stories, and that Doyle wanted him to exemplify. One is truth. There are truths about the world that are absolute. They are not relative to a given person or a given society or a given time. They are really truths about the world that are there independently of the way we think about things. They are thus universal. So the first value really is truth. Holmes tries to get it right. The second, knowledge. It's possible to know at least some of these objective truths. Knowledge is attainable. Now that's not to say we can know everything, but there are lots of things we can know. What's the best way to do that? Through the use of reason. Emotion is a threat to that. Reason is the tool for getting at knowledge of objective truth. And what's the paradigm of that use of reason? Scientific method. Progress. If we act rationally on the basis of that knowledge that's objective, we will improve the world. That is our best route to progress. Our best route not only to solving crimes, but in general to achieving our aims. And finally then, well, yeah, Lots of things here, but I guess the thing I want to observe here really is that in the end, there is a tragic vision about this. If it is possible to use reason to make progress and know objective truth about the world, nevertheless, in the end, we have to make choices. And sometimes those choices are hard, and we don't always make them correctly. Even Holmes doesn't always solve the crime or make the right choice.